She had been watching him for hours, convinced he was helpless. The human had crash-landed on Vecta Prime, a planet dominated by the warrior race known as the Zalari. To them, he was nothing more than a fragile creature, an off-worlder who would not survive the night without assistance. Commander Zelvira crouched on the high ridge, her violet-hued eyes narrowing as she observed the human struggle. His ship was a twisted wreck, smoke curling into the emerald sky. He limped away from the wreckage, clutching his side. Blood stained his torn uniform, and his breathing was ragged. Typical, she thought. Humans were fragile creatures, soft-bodied and weak. Yet something about this one unsettled her. Unlike most off-worlders who panicked in the wilds of Vecta Prime, he moved with quiet precision, examining his surroundings carefully. He tore a strip from his uniform and pressed it against his wound. His hands were steady. His expression remained unreadable. Zelvira knew she should leave him. The human would not last long against the predators lurking in the shadows. But something gnawed at her instincts. She had fought humans before. They were clever, but never a real threat. Still, her gut told her there was more to this one than met the eye. As dusk settled, she finally descended from her hiding spot. The human had made a small fire, keeping the darkness at bay. He didn't flinch when she emerged from the trees, her tall, armored form casting a long shadow over him. "You're in dangerous territory, off-worlder," she said in her native Zalari tongue, expecting him to look at her in confusion. But he didn't. Instead, he slowly lifted his gaze, and then, in perfect, fluent Zalari, he replied, "I was beginning to wonder when you'd show yourself." Zelvira froze. No human should have been able to speak her language so flawlessly. Her grip on her weapon tightened as she studied him anew. His expression remained calm, but his eyes, they held knowledge, understanding, and something else. "Who are you?" she demanded, stepping closer. He exhaled slowly and, for the first time, allowed a small smile to tug at his lips. "Just a traveler," he said. "One who has been to places your kind has only whispered about." Zelvira felt a chill run down her spine. The human was no ordinary soldier. She had underestimated him. The question was, how much? Zelvira's instincts screamed at her to be cautious. No human should have been able to speak Zalari with such perfect fluency, let alone carry himself with the calm assurance of a warrior. She studied him carefully, noting the slight tension in his muscles, the way his eyes flicked to her weapon, calculating distances, possibilities. He wasn't just a traveler. He was something else. "You're lying," she said coldly, shifting her stance. "Humans don't come here. And they certainly don't learn our tongue like a native." The human exhaled, his breath visible in the cool evening air. "You assume too much, Commander Zelvira," he said smoothly. Her fingers twitched around the grip of her blade. "You know my name?" "Of course," he said. "I've studied your people. And you, in particular, have quite the reputation." Zelvira didn't like that. This was no lost soldier. This was someone who had come to Vecta Prime intentionally. Her mind raced through possibilities. A spy? No, humans never had the capability to infiltrate their kind. A rogue scientist? No, he moved like a fighter. So what was he? The human shifted, grimacing slightly as he adjusted his wounded side. "You don't trust me," he said. "That's fair. I wouldn't trust me either." Zelvira's grip tightened. "Then why are you here? And don't waste my time with riddles." The human studied her for a moment before leaning forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Because Vecta Prime is about to be attacked." Her breath caught in her throat. "Lies." "You know it's not," he countered. "The Syndicate has been moving pieces for months. Your leadership is blind to it. They think they have time. They don't." Zelvira felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. The Syndicate, the shadow empire that had swallowed entire systems, had been a distant threat. But if what he said was true, her mind warred between disbelief and the sinking feeling that he was right. "Why should I believe you?" she asked, testing him. The human smiled again, but this time, there was something sharper behind it. "Because I wasn't the only one who came to this planet. And the others? They aren't here to talk." A distant explosion cracked through the night. Zelvira's head snapped toward the horizon, where a plume of fire and smoke rose against the darkening sky. The human sighed. "I was hoping we had more time." Zelvira turned back to him, her heart pounding. "Who are you?" He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Call me Nathan. And if you want to save your planet, you're going to have to trust me." For the first time in her life, Zelvira felt truly uncertain. But as the sounds of battle grew louder in the distance, she knew one thing for sure: whether she liked it or not, she needed him. And she hated that. Zelvira's jaw clenched. Every instinct told her to kill the human and be done with it. But the explosion in the distance changed everything. If the syndicate truly was here, she couldn't afford to waste time. Nathan pushed himself up slowly, wincing but managing to stand. "We need to move," he said, brushing dirt from his torn uniform. "Unless you'd rather wait for them to find us first." Zelvira narrowed her eyes, but nodded. Without another word, she turned and led him through the dense underbrush, her mind racing. They moved swiftly, weaving between twisted roots and towering rock formations. The jungle whispered around them, hiding threats in its shadows. Zelvira knew this terrain better than anyone, but Nathan, despite his injury, kept up with an ease that unsettled her. "You move well for a human," she muttered. Nathan smirked. "I've had practice." They reached a clearing, the night air thick with the scent of burning fuel. In the distance, the syndicate's drop ships descended like black daggers, their engines howling against the wind. Zelvira's stomach turned. He had been telling the truth. She turned to him sharply. "How did you know about this?" Nathan exhaled. "Because I used to work for them." The words hit her like a strike to the chest. She drew her blade in a flash, leveling it at his throat. "Your syndicate?" "Was," he corrected, raising his hands. "Until I realized what they really were." Zelvira's fingers itched to carve the truth from him. "Give me one reason not to kill you right now." Nathan's gaze hardened. "Because I know their plan. I know where they'll strike first. And I know how to stop them." She studied him, searching for deception. He met her stare without flinching. Then he said something that made her blood run cold. "They're not here to conquer, Zelvira. They're here to eradicate your people." Her pulse pounded. Conquering was one thing. Warriors could fight. But eradication? That meant slaughter. That meant no one would be spared. Nathan took a step closer, lowering his voice. "They have a bioweapon. Something designed to wipe out Zalari DNA completely. It's already on the planet." Zelvira's grip tightened around her blade. If this was true, her entire species was on the brink of extinction. "Where is it?" she demanded. Nathan hesitated. Then, for the first time, his confidence wavered. "They don't have it yet," he admitted. "But they will, unless we get to it first." Zelvira's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Nathan exhaled sharply. "The syndicate didn't bring the weapon with them. It's already on Vecta Prime, buried deep beneath your capital city. Your ancestors hid it centuries ago, long before your people even knew the syndicate existed. And now, they've finally figured out where to dig." Zelvira felt the ground shift beneath her, not physically, but in a way that made her stomach churn. Her ancestors had created a weapon capable of wiping out their entire species, and now their greatest enemy was about to claim it? Nathan's voice cut through the storm in her mind. "You want to save your people, Commander?" he asked. "Then you're going to have to beat them to it." For the first time in her life, Zelvira felt fear, not for herself, but for her entire world. And she hated that. But she hated the syndicate more. She lowered her blade. "Then we move now," she said. Nathan's smirk returned. "Now that's what I was hoping to hear." Together, they disappeared into the night. The race had begun, and the fate of an entire species hung in the balance. They moved through the dense jungle like shadows, their pace relentless. The syndicate's ships loomed overhead, their searchlights cutting through the darkness, scanning for movement. Zelvira's pulse was steady, her mind razor-sharp. She didn't trust Nathan, couldn't trust him. But right now, he was the only advantage she had. As they neared the cliffs overlooking the capital city, Nathan suddenly halted. His head tilted slightly, as if listening to something Zelvira couldn't hear. "What?" she demanded. His expression darkened. "We're not alone." Before she could ask what he meant, something massive crashed through the trees behind them. Zelvira spun, her blade flashing, just as a hulking figure stepped into view. It wasn't Syndicate. It was Zalari, but not like any Zalari she had ever seen. The warrior's skin was ashen gray, its eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. Veins pulsed black along its arms, and its mouth twisted into a cruel, empty grin. Nathan swore under his breath. "Oh hell." Zelvira's instinct screamed. This was wrong. Deeply, horribly wrong. Then the thing spoke. Too late. It rasped in a voice that sounded layered, as if something else was speaking through it. You cannot stop what has already begun. The warrior lunged. Zelvira barely had time to react before she was on the ground, pinned beneath strength that shouldn't have been possible. Nathan moved fast. A single, precise shot from a hidden pulse weapon struck the creature's head, but instead of collapsing, it only twitched. Zelvira snarled, driving her knee into the thing's gut and flipping it off her. She landed on her feet, her blade already cutting in a deadly arc, only for the warrior to catch her sword mid-swing. Zelvira's eyes widened. No Zalari should have been able to do that. Nathan grabbed her arm, yanking her back as the creature's strength forced the blade from her grip. "We need to run," he said. Zelvira never ran from a fight, but the way the thing was moving, the way its wounds healed before her eyes, told her all she needed to know. This wasn't a warrior. This was a test subject. Her ancestors hadn't just created a weapon. They had created something else. Something that refused to die. Nathan pulled her back into the jungle as more glowing-eyed figures emerged from the shadows. "They're already awake," he said grimly. "And if the Syndicate gets their hands on them..." Zelvira didn't need him to finish. If the Syndicate wanted the ancient weapon beneath their capital, they had no idea that the real weapon had already been unleashed. And it wasn't on their side. Zelvira ran through the dense undergrowth, her mind racing as fast as her feet. This wasn't just a battle anymore. It was a nightmare. The Syndicate thought they were coming to claim a bioweapon hidden beneath the capital. But the real weapon wasn't buried. It was walking, hunting. The creatures, former Zalari warriors twisted by whatever dark science her ancestors had abandoned, were already awake. And worse, they weren't mindless. Nathan ducked behind a massive root, pulling Zelvira down with him just as another of the twisted warriors stalked past, its glowing eyes sweeping over the jungle. "We need to move," she began. Nathan held up a hand, signaling silence. His gaze was locked on the creature. Then, in a move that sent a chill down her spine, the thing turned its head sharply in their direction. It had heard her, and it smiled. Nathan grabbed her wrist. "Run." The thing let out an unearthly shriek and charged. Zelvira exploded into motion. She had fought beasts, assassins, and syndicate elites, but nothing about this felt like combat. It felt like being hunted. Ahead, the cliffside loomed. Below, the capital city sprawled, syndicate dropships descending like black locusts. The war had already begun. Zelvira made a split-second decision. "Jump," she commanded. Nathan didn't argue. Together, they leapt off the edge. For a moment, there was only the wind roaring past her ears, the weightlessness of freefall. Then, impact. Zelvira hit a sloping rooftop, rolling to absorb the shock. Nathan landed beside her, his breath ragged but controlled. Above them, the creatures stood at the cliff's edge, watching, waiting. Nathan groaned. "That's not a good sign." Zelvira ignored him, rising to her feet. The city was in chaos. Syndicate forces clashed with Zalari warriors in the streets. Fires burned, and deep beneath their feet, the true weapon, the one the Syndicate thought they had come for, was waiting. But something wasn't adding up. She turned to Nathan. "You said the Syndicate didn't bring the bioweapon, that it was already here." "Yeah," he said, dusting himself off. "And?" Zelvira's eyes narrowed. "Then why are they here?" She gestured toward the glowing-eyed warriors watching them from above. They weren't just waiting for the Syndicate. They were waking up either way. Nathan went still. Then, slowly, he cursed under his breath. "Oh hell." Zelvira felt her stomach turn. "You thought the Syndicate was the threat," she said. "You thought they were after the weapon." Nathan exhaled. "I did." Her hands clenched into fists. "But the Syndicate isn't the real danger here, is it?" Nathan looked up at the creatures once more. "No," he admitted grimly. "They're not." A deep, echoing boom sounded beneath their feet. The ground trembled. The air seemed to hum with energy. And from the depths of the capital, something ancient answered the call. Whatever her ancestors had hidden, whatever nightmare had been locked away, it was waking up, and everything was about to change. Zelvira barely had time to react before the ground beneath them split open. A deafening roar echoed through the city as buildings trembled, their foundations shaking from the force of whatever was awakening below. Nathan steadied himself, eyes wide with realization. "We need to get underground. Now." Zelvira didn't argue. The creatures on the cliffside were no longer watching. They were moving, leaping down impossibly fast, heading straight for the cracks forming in the earth. The Syndicate troops, caught between the chaos, hesitated. Some opened fire on the creatures, but their weapons did nothing. The twisted Zalari warriors barely flinched, cutting through Syndicate soldiers with terrifying efficiency. Zelvira and Nathan sprinted through the streets, dodging falling debris and bursts of gunfire. They reached a temple entrance, a structure older than the city itself. The ground trembled violently as they forced open the massive stone doors and slipped inside. The air was thick with dust and the weight of something ancient. Glowing symbols lined the walls, pulsing as if responding to their presence. Nathan exhaled sharply. This is it. The vault. Zelvira stepped forward cautiously. At the heart of the chamber, an enormous metallic structure lay embedded in the stone. It pulsed with a low, rhythmic hum. This isn't just a weapon, she whispered. It's a prison. Nathan glanced at her. Then whatever's inside. The entire chamber shook. A deep, inhuman voice resonated from the metallic structure, ancient and powerful. At last free. The vault ruptured. A massive figure stepped forward, taller than any Zalari, its body shifting like liquid metal, yet shaped in something resembling their own kind. Its eyes burned with a light older than the stars. Zelvira's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a weapon. This was the first of their kind. The original Zalari. And it was angry. The twisted warriors who had followed them fell to their knees, their glowing eyes dimming as if they were mere echoes of what stood before them. The Syndicate ships above wavered, their engines faltering under an unseen force. Nathan exhaled slowly. Well, that's definitely not good. The ancient being turned its gaze on Zelvira. You are the last of the untainted. Its voice was like a storm breaking over mountains. You have inherited a broken empire, built upon the sins of your ancestors. Zelvira tightened her grip on her blade, even as her instincts screamed that no weapon would save her. And what are you? She demanded. The being's burning gaze flickered. I am what they tried to forget, what they tried to bury. The air in the chamber shifted. Energy crackled like lightning, coiling around the being's form. Nathan nudged Zelvira. Just a thought, he murmured. But maybe we don't let this thing out into the rest of the city? Zelvira's mind raced. If this creature was what her ancestors had locked away, they had failed to destroy it. But now, she had a choice. She could try to run, try to fight, or she sheathed her blade. You were imprisoned for a reason, she said. The world changed without you. The ancient being tilted its head. Then let me see what remains. The temple walls groaned. The Syndicate forces above screamed as their ships were crushed midair, their metal folding like paper. The corrupted warriors dissolved into dust, and the being stepped forward. Nathan sighed. Well, that's one way to end a war. Zelvira exhaled. This isn't over. She wasn't sure if she had saved her people, or doomed them to something worse. But there was no turning back now. As the first dawn broke over the ruined capital, the last of the true Zalari walked among them once more. And the galaxy would never be the same.